Back in 1999, NATO did something that left a lot of foreign policy experts scratching their heads. They bombed Yugoslavia for 78 days over the crisis in Kosovo. And to many, it just didn't make sense. It didn't seem to serve any obvious strategic interest, which led to some pretty sharp criticism right out of the gate. In fact, critics immediately jumped on it, and they came up with this really cutting phrase. They called it foreign policy as social work. The implication being, this whole thing was driven by feelings, not by cold, hard strategy.
And that wasn't a one-off comment. You had others echoing that exact same idea, basically framing the mission as this reluctant, half-hearted attempt at playing empire, but without any of the usual confidence or clear purpose.
And this view was pretty much everywhere. People agreed that stopping atrocities was a noble goal, sure, but they also saw it as kind of naive, totally disconnected from the tough realities of what's good for your own country. Okay, so that's the big puzzle we're going to unpack here. If it wasn't about the usual strategic calculations, what on earth could have pushed the most powerful military alliance in the world into a war? So first, let's take a look at the easy answers, the usual suspects that were offered up at the time. They sound pretty logical on the surface, but as you're about to see, they don't really hold water. The two main arguments you heard were credibility and stability. The idea that NATO had to make good on its threats and that it had to prevent a fire from spreading in the powder keg of Europe. But here's the kicker. Italy, the NATO country that was literally right next door and most threatened by all this instability, was actually the most hesitant to get involved. That's a huge inconsistency, and it kind of suggests there's something else going on here. And to find that something else, we have to look beyond the typical foreign policy stuff and dig into the actual psychology of nations themselves. All right, so there's this key concept called ontological security. I know, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a really powerful idea. It argues that states, just like you and me, have this deep, fundamental need to feel secure in who they are, to really believe in the story they tell about themselves. To put it simply, it's all about keeping a particular story going. So if a nation sees itself as a defender of human rights, it has to act like one. Otherwise, that whole self-image starts to crumble. And what's the biggest threat to that national story? Shame. Shame is that powerful gut punch of a feeling a nation gets when what it does, or more importantly, what it fails to do, goes against its own identity. It creates this really painful internal conflict. Okay, so how does all this connect back to Kosovo? Well, the core argument here is that the major NATO powers weren't really being driven by strategic goals for the future. They were being driven by the shame of their failures in the past. You have to remember, the 1990s were just haunted by these ghosts of inaction. For the big Western powers, the memories of appeasing Hitler in the 30s, of waiting too long to act in Bosnia, and maybe worst of all, of standing by while genocide happened in Rwanda, all of that created this deep sense of anxiety. So when the Kosovo crisis blew up, it felt like a terrible sequel they had already seen. Let's start with the United States. For them, one particular ghost loomed larger than any other: their failure to do anything about the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And the evidence for this is incredibly direct. President Bill Clinton himself said that not trying to stop the Rwandan genocide was one of the biggest regrets of his entire presidency. That's not just a political soundbite. That's a public admission of a profound national shame. And that failure was absolutely hanging over his administration as the Kosovo crisis unfolded. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Britain was being haunted by a couple of different specters. The first was that deep historical shame of appeasing Hitler back in the 1930s. And the second was the much more recent failure to act decisively in Bosnia. And you can see how British leaders were drawing this direct line from the past to the present. The UK's defense secretary came right out and invoked the lesson of Munich, basically saying, look, we learned that appeasing a dictator doesn't work. For Britain, Kosovo was a chance to finally get it right this time. Now, Germany's situation is maybe the most fascinating and complex of them all. Its entire post-war identity was built on two ideas that were kind of in tension with each other: a deep-seated pacifism because of Nazi militarism, and the absolute moral duty of never again because of the Holocaust. So when faced with ethnic cleansing happening again in Europe, Chancellor Schroeder argued that Germany's unique history actually gave it a special responsibility to act. The shame of the Holocaust ended up overriding the guilt of militarism. And for the first time since World War II, Germany sent combat troops into a conflict, not in spite of its past, but because of it. So, let's pull all these threads together. What's so crucial to understand is that this wasn't one single motive. It was this powerful mix of individual national shames all coming to a head at once. You can see it right here. The US was driven by the ghost of Rwanda. The UK was driven by the lessons of appeasement in Bosnia. And Germany was driven by the moral weight of the Holocaust. They all acted together, but each nation was trying to heal its own unique historical wound and, in a way, fix its own story.
So you might be asking, why does this idea of ontological security really matter? Well, it's a game changer for how we think about why nations do what they do, especially when it comes to war.
The big takeaway here is that this completely breaks down that old wall between doing the right thing and acting in your own self-interest. Think about it. Protecting a nation's story, its very sense of who it is a powerful form of self-interest. So, from this angle, the Kosovo intervention wasn't some naive social work project at all. It was a deeply rational act of psychological self-preservation. It shows us that an action can be genuinely good for other people and at the very same time be absolutely essential for a nation's own soul.
And that leaves us with this really interesting kind of thorny question to think about. When a nation acts to stop a tragedy, but in doing so, it also gets to heal a past shame and reinforce its own heroic story, does that make the act any less noble? Or does it just make it more, well, human?
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take complex global issues and give you the essential distilled insights.
Today we're looking at something really fascinating, the 1999 NATO intervention in Kosovo.
And it's a remarkable case study, isn't it? Mainly because of how it was dismissed at the time by so many commentators.
Oh, absolutely. They were incredibly cynical. You'd hear things like it was unimportant to any vital American interests. Some even called it empire as social work.
That social work framing is really our starting point for this deep dive. Our sources point out how critics insisted foreign policy had to be, purely rational.
Right. All about traditional security interests, resources, alliances, that sort of thing.
So any emotional response, any kind of visceral reaction to the refugee crisis that some senators were talking about, that was immediately labeled as naive.
Or moralistic, but definitely not rational. The dominant thinking was that an action was either strategic and rational, or it was morally noble, but, ultimately irrelevant to serious geopolitics.
Couldn't be both.
It could not be both.
And our mission today is to really challenge that divide. We're exploring a theory that connects all of it: morality, emotion, and hard security. It's called ontological security.
Which is basically a state's need to maintain a coherent sense of its own identity, its own story, its biographical narrative over time.
So the core argument we're pulling from the evidence is that this intervention wasn't just about helping people or about strategy.
It was an effort by key NATO members, we're talking mainly the US, the UK, and Germany, to deal with their own national shame over past failures.
Kosovo gave them a chance to go the other way, so to speak, to repair a damaged part of their identity.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack that. We should probably start with the historical scene and why the standard explanations for this war just don't quite add up.
Right. Well, the crisis had been building for a long time, ever since Milosevic took away Kosovo's autonomy back in 1989.
And things escalated pretty dramatically in the late 90s.
They did, with the rise of the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army. That led to a really aggressive Serb military response in 1998.
And the global flashpoint. What was a moment everyone tuned in?
That would be the Rakak massacre, January 1999. 45 ethnic Albanians executed by Serbian forces. The images went global.
And for NATO, that was it.
That was it. It was seen as definitive proof that Milosevic wouldn't stick to any deal. The peace talks at Rambouillet failed, and NATO airstrikes began on March 24th.
And this is where the traditional theories of international relations start to, fall apart.
They really do. Take neorealism. The world in 1999 was unipolar. The US was the undisputed superpower.
And neorealism would predict that a superpower would basically ignore a conflict in a weak state like Yugoslavia.
Precisely. No vital resources, no major sea lanes, no nukes. So why on earth would the US commit so many resources to intervening?
Okay, let me challenge that for a second. Couldn't you argue that even if it was framed as social work, it was still a strategic move? Expanding NATO's influence, reinforcing the new post-Cold War order in Europe, that's a security interest.
Right.
It is. And it certainly did reinforce that order after the decision was made. but the sources suggest the initial motivation wasn't purely about that kind of structural game.
How so?
Well, if it was, why were some NATO members so much more enthusiastic than others? The core objective was always framed around stopping human rights abuses, not, say, gaining a geopolitical edge on Russia.
Right. Neorealism has a hard time explaining the sheer level of commitment.
It does. Then you have liberalism, which might argue that domestic pressure from the public forced the intervention.
But that doesn't quite tell the whole story either, does it?
No, it's incomplete. Domestic pressure was a huge factor, but the evidence shows it mostly constrained the strategy.
Ah, so it forced them into the high-altitude bombing campaign.
Exactly. Public fear of casualties, thanks in part to Somalia a few years earlier, was so high that they had to keep their own losses at basically zero. So it explains how they fought, but not why they decided to fight in the first place.
Which brings us to the argument about NATO's credibility. That seems like a really strong one.
It's where a lot of people land. I mean, you had Britain's Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, saying it explicitly. What credibility would NATO be left with if we did not stir to stop him?
Makes sense. If you make a threat, you have to follow through. Otherwise, the whole alliance is just a paper tiger.
It's a powerful rationale, but it only explains why you fulfill a promise. It doesn't explain why you made such a huge, risky promise about Kosovo in the first place.
And that leads to this bizarre geographic puzzle.
It really does. The desire for military action was, and this is a quote, in inverse proportion to the distance from Kosovo.
That just completely flips the strategic map on its head.
It does. The US and the UK, thousands of miles away, are the most determined. Italy, right next door, with the most to gain from stability, was the most reluctant.
So if it's not about proximity or resources, what kind of rationality are we actually seeing?
And that brings us back to this deeper level of security, ontological security.
So how do you get from an emotion like shame to something that counts as a rational security interest?
You have to sort of redefine what rational action is. In this context, it's any act that makes sense because it serves to maintain a state's core identity, its self-narrative.
So protecting that identity from collapsing is the highest form of security.
It absolutely is. So the intervention wasn't a charity case or a lapse in judgment. It was internal maintenance. It was about preventing a national anxiety attack that could lead to, real political instability.
And the core driver here is this idea of metaphorical shame.
Right. When the images of refugees and massacres started showing up on TV, they triggered these incredibly painful historical memories for the big NATO powers.
Rwanda, Bosnia, even the Holocaust.
Exactly. And this wasn't just sadness, it was a threat to their constructed self-identity as good or responsible post-World War II powers. And that shame created this extreme national anxiety.
This is where capability, a state's actual power, becomes so important.
Yes, this connects it right back to hard power. NATO's collective capabilities, all that military might, actually magnified the anxiety.
Because if you have the tools to stop an atrocity,
then the self-identity cost of not acting is just immeasurably higher. The ability to act made inaction intolerable. Capability increased the cost of looking away.
Okay, that context is vital. Let's do the deep dive now into the unique sources of this shame for each of the major players. Because NATO wasn't a monolith here.
Not at all. The motivations were deeply individual. Let's start with the United States. For them, the shame was a direct result of their inaction during the Rwandan genocide in 1994.
A horrifying moment. The Clinton administration effectively stood by while somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people were slaughtered in 100 days.
And it weighed so heavily on President Clinton. The sources quote him expressing deep regret, saying something like, "A few thousand troops could have saved a couple 100,000 lives."
So the US was paralyzed by one foreign policy failure in Somalia, which then led to this catastrophic moral failure in Rwanda. Kosovo was the chance to break that cycle.
It was a necessary moral corrective. One administration official is quoted anonymously saying that Kosovo was our first opportunity to act on what we learned in Rwanda. The US needed to redefine itself as a country that could and would stop a genocide.
And Clinton also had to change the whole story about what these conflicts even were.
He did. Before, conflicts in Bosnia and Rwanda were often described as intractable, ancient tribal hatreds.
Which is a convenient way to absolve yourself of any responsibility to act.
Exactly. But with Kosovo, the US narrative shifted to an instrumentalist view that this conflict was being driven by specific elites, namely Milosevic. And if it's about specific actors, well, then it's a problem that external intervention can actually solve.
A remarkable shift in framing, driven by shame. Now let's go across the Atlantic to the United Kingdom. They had their own ghosts.
For the British, it was a mix. Anxiety over the appeasement of Hitler before World War II, and more recently, the delayed response in Bosnia in the early 90s.
So it wasn't just about future credibility. They were almost trying to relitigate the failures of the past century.
That's a great way to put it. Prime Minister Tony Blair constantly brought up the 1930s, comparing Milosevic to a modern tyrant. He said the operation was a test to ensure that the 21st century does not begin with a continuing reminder of the worst aspects of the century now drawing to a close.
Wow. Those words carry so much historical weight.
They really do. And there's this powerful anecdote from the defense secretary at the time, Jeffrey Robertson. He describes meeting an Auschwitz survivor in 1999 who told him he was seeing genocide happening again in Kosovo.
And that just solidified it.
He said it solidified their determination to say, and actually mean, never again. For them, the shame of historical cowardice was too much to bear a second time.
Now for Germany, this is maybe the most profound story. Their participation meant deploying combat troops outside German borders for the first time since World War II. A huge moment.
It forced this incredible clash between two deep parts of their national identity, guilt versus shame.
What's the distinction there?
Well, the guilt was expressed through this very strong pacifist tradition. The idea that Germany must never again participate in military action. But on the other side was the shame, the overwhelming moral need to atone for the Holocaust.
And in the end, shame won out.
Shame won. The need to atone for the Holocaust was the only force powerful enough to override their post-war pacifism.
So how did they sell that politically at home, especially to their own pacifist base?
Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder framed it in terms of historical responsibility. He said he didn't want his kids asking him about Kosovo the same way his generation asked their parents about the 1930s. Why did you not do anything?
So this was about Germany finally becoming a normal country.
Exactly. They called it becoming a nation of adults, taking responsibility. They had to shed the shame of inaction to finally heal their own political identity.
What an incredible picture of a collective identity repair project. So what about the other NATO members like France and Italy?
Well, France, despite its historical ties to Serbia and Russia, was very supportive. They framed it as defending the universal values of our republican tradition. It was about asserting their identity as a key architect of the post-war European project.
And Italy, the most reluctant one.
Italy had huge domestic resistance. So to manage that, they balanced their NATO commitment by heavily emphasizing their humanitarian mission, the Arcobaleno mission.
So they could frame their involvement as humanitarian aid, not a military action.
Which made it acceptable to a deeply pacifist public. It just shows how central these identity narratives were for every country involved.
Let's talk about the legacy. This shame over Rwanda, it really cast a long shadow, didn't it? It kept coming up in later policy debates.
It absolutely did. The never again rhetoric became almost institutionalized. In 2003, you have Colin Powell arguing for intervention in Liberia by saying, "We looked away once before in Rwanda." Senator John Corsine said about Darfur, "The essence of who we are is at stake." The memory was still raw.
But the U.S. response in both Darfur and Liberia was much more limited than in Kosovo, even with all that strong rhetoric. If the shame was still there, why wasn't the action?
And this is where the model is so useful. The anxiety might be there, but three things blocked the path to a major intervention. First, U.S. capabilities were just stretched thin by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
So the resources weren't there to make inaction feel quite so intolerable.
Precisely. Second, there was way less intense, 247 media coverage of Darfur and Liberia. You didn't have as many of those specter images generating widespread national anxiety. Shame needs a spotlight.
And the third factor?
Simple bureaucratic resistance. The Defense Department, for its own reasons, successfully delayed or shelved proposals for any large-scale intervention. The shame was there, but the conditions just weren't right for it to translate into another major war.
What an incredible analysis. So, to sum this up, the Kosovo intervention wasn't just a strategic move or a moral crusade. It was a profound act of national self-definition for the countries involved.
It's just overwhelming evidence that humanitarian action can be a rational security interest. States intervene in part because the self-identity cost of doing nothing when you have the power to act is simply too high to bear.
So what does this mean for how we should think about global affairs? It seems to really challenge that old meta-narrative that a nation's top priority is always its physical survival?
Well, if a state's most pressing security interest is, at times, defining who it is, repairing its own story, rather than just ensuring that it is, then we need a fundamentally different way to understand why major powers go to war. It suggests that identity, history, and anxiety are just as real in politics as missiles in GDP, and maybe sometimes even more powerful.